we're technologied out tonight, as you might see, because for the first time we're live streaming this event. So hello, where's the camera? To everybody who's on the live. Well, there's only a couple of us can actually wave. I don't know if Duncan's the kind of guy that waves, but you might try it. There he is. Also hello to Roy, who is his 16-year-old son, who he foolishly mentioned that this was being... He found out for himself. He's that kind of guy. And he's obviously going to be making sarcastic comments about his dad's performance all night. So, hello. That's what sons are for. Anyway, what Duncan is for is kicking off a very interesting discussion tonight. And I should say, actually, thank you to Democracy TV, who are streaming this for us. It's a very interesting and timely Nordic Horizons event tonight because we're talking about the land use. You'll know that land reform is being discussed very vigorously in the Parliament at the moment, and there might even be a report from the Rural Affairs Committee which might hasten a debate in Holyrood upon the land reform bill before Christmas, actually, which is kind of speedy. And in all of that, there's very often the question raised, really, what's wrong with the way land's used at the moment? What more could you do with land? Are the sort of empty, barren wastelands that cover much of the Highlands, is that just the way it is? Or is there something better that could happen with that kind of land? And is use, management or ownership key in all of this? And these questions go round and round, and they have done, as many of you will know, for some years, in fact, several decades. So not that Duncan is coming with a kind of particular axe to grind on any of this, but he's got a very interesting set of observations. He's a researcher with NINA, which is the Norwegian equivalent of Scottish Natural Heritage, and he's a specialist. He's written loads of tracts on a whole stack of different things: woodland, deer management, beavers, and land use in general. And I noticed one of his very interesting papers was why the Cairngorms and South West Norway should get to know one another better. Now, that's really the theme of tonight. Because I think a lot of people, when they try to make comparisons with Norway and Scotland, we're told that those comparisons are invalid because basically the parts of Norway we're talking about cannot be compared with Scotland because, and then you fill in all the various reasons. Having made a really very, very intimate study of all of this, Duncan's in a pretty good position to say whether there's a comparison that could be made and really what you could then say about the difference that there's been in the last 50 years in Norway on account of the way that land use is operated there. And just as if he planned this like a film star, here comes our sponsor for the evening, Rob Gibson. Who are you ready to say a few words, Rob? Right. You can actually clap and things like that if you want, because this isn't the floor of Holyrood. Rob?
Thank you. Sorry,
That's just for live streaming us, Rob. So we need you like this to be heard at the body of the curtain, but we need you to use that at the same time. It's weird.
So good evening. Sorry I'm slightly late. I've been dealing with urgent business. As far as this is concerned, I'm delighted to host this meeting. Of course, there is any likelihood of an emergency. There's no likely we have to leave the building sharpish by the nearest exit, which is probably there, but there is a fire exit too. This is quite important because the more we compare what we're doing in our countries, and I think when I get a chance to reply I might be able to stimulate some of that debate, but I'm most interested to hear what's got to be said about Norway in this case, because we've had a whole series of these meetings, and it's a great pleasure to be here to actually host this and take part. Thank you.
Grand. Okay, thanks very much. Is there something happening that we don't know about, Rob, that you know we should be aware of vis-a-vis leaving buildings imminently? Or is that just your regular patter when you open a meeting?
It's the patter.
It's the patter, right, okay. And relax, okay. Right, so without further ado, could I please introduce Duncan Halley?
Well, thank you very much, Leslie, and I'd like to say also thank you to Alison Balharry for very efficiently organising this. My subject tonight is landscape history and land use in South West Norway. I should say, a slight correction, the organisation I work for is more like a hybrid of the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology and the James Hutton Institute rather than SNH. It's an independent, not-for-profit institute, and it works in fish and game management, monitoring biodiversity, ecosystem services, sustainability and community development of natural resource management. We have about 140 scientific staff, and our turnover is about 36 million euros a year. So this is the kind of thing that we do. This is the portal for everything about deer in Norway, everything from, in the main picture there, bringing on the next generation of hunters, to the nitty-gritty of the data on which management decisions for deer are based. We also do things like environmental restoration, sometimes in a typically robust Norwegian manner. And of course we publish scientific papers like this one, which is on getting better metrics for some of the work that we do. Before I start to talk proper, I want to make a couple of geographical definitions. It is a very large mistake to talk about Norway as if it were a single unit. If you look at the width of the country there, if the west coast were on the west coast of Wales, then the eastern border would be in the Sea of Norfolk. If you took the northern extremity of Norway and put it at John O'Groats, the southern extremity would be off Spain. Generalising about a place that large, especially on biological subjects, is a clear mistake. So, southwest Norway, as I define it, is shown here in blue. It's an area the same size as Highland region, Western Isles and Argyll and Bute put together, and it stretches from the latitude of about Harris and Ullapool up to the latitude of Hermanus. Now sometimes, because the data comes to me in this way and I can't disaggregate it, I will talk about West Norway, by which I mean West Norway statistical region, shown in this map here. The climate actually, even the north of this, is really quite like Scotland, but in order to draw my conclusions as narrowly as possible with respect to Scotland, I'm using southwest Norway, except when I say otherwise. The area of South West Norway statistical region is about the same size as Scotland, north and west of the Firth of Tay and Clyde. Now, an example of an overgeneralisation that can be misleading is that Norway is well wooded, always has been. Most people know this. And for southwest Norway, most people know wrong. This is West Norway in the 1940s. The lady has been engaged in digging peat. The quantity of peat here is very large for one farm. That's, of course, because it's about to be sold commercially. And the environment otherwise, apart from a couple of small farm woodlands in the background recently established, is completely open. This isn't in any way unusual. The whole of West or southwest Norway looked like this, and for a very long time. This is Oslibake in Rogaland in 1911. That's south of Stavanger. It's about the same latitude as Thurso. You can see that the landscape is open moorland essentially. There are long dry stone dikes snaking through the landscape, built over the centuries given the lack of any other material with which to make boundaries. Just like Scotland, you'll find old peat diggings with big old pine roots from the period when it was afforested. And in some cases, the exploitation of peat was on a truly industrial scale. This is Fedja Island. The peat from here was transported in very large trains to the coast and then was sent to Bergen as the main source of domestic and industrial fuel in the later 19th and early 20th centuries. The reason again being that regionally there was no real alternative fuel that was economically available. And this persisted for a long time. Now, this is rather a complex graph, but it is, I think, important to understand it. The timeline is from 10,000 years ago, top left in this picture, to 0, which is now. So this is a long time. The dotted line means that deforestation is in progress at the 56 sites up and down the coast that were covered in this paper. The solid line means final moorland establishment, and if there's a dashed line, it means rather that it was permanent grassland that established. And the overall picture is of three major periods of deforestation, the bands marked in yellow, and a continuing process, starting with the beginning of farming in the Neolithic period and essentially complete by the Bronze Age, which is 4,000 years ago. So this is a landscape that has been almost completely deforested for millennia. So to summarise that, peat was the main source of domestic fuel because the area has been essentially open moorland, substantially complete by the Bronze Age. Now, inland in the district, further deforestation and moorland establishment continued to the Viking era and beyond, and reaching its maximum extent in the 19th century, and this is broadly similar to Scotland. The open landscape was anthropogenic in origin, in other words, man-made, due primarily to the effects of grazing and associated activities like muir burn and use for firewood. Now, if I were to suggest to you that we ought to compare California and Scotland, for example, you might object that the climate of California isn't very similar. So let's look in some detail at climate comparisons. There's the Met Office map of the rainfall in Scotland. The weather comes primarily from the west and southwest. The rain is heavy on the west coast, peaks as it rises over the mountains inland, and then tends with variations for mountain height to get less as you go east. And it peaks at a bit over 3,000 millimetres a year. Norway has the same airstream and the same effect happens. The weather systems come in mostly from the west and southwest. They rise over the mountains, and in fact the rainfall is rather higher at its peak than anywhere in Scotland. It's over 4,000 millimetres, and then it declines again as you go east. If one looks at the mean annual temperatures, I've coloured here the nearest bands the same colours. So for example, the pink is 6 to 8 in the Norwegian map and the East Scotland map, but there is a slight variation. It's 6 to 8.5 in the North Scotland map, because that's how the data comes to me. But as you can see, broadly the temperatures in the two regions are very similar. And this holds whether you're talking about the summer temperatures, these are the July averages, or in winter, the January averages. A small part of our region is rather colder than Scotland. That's because there's a ridge of mountains that are rather higher than Scottish mountains at that point. And if you look at winds, these are the average mean annual wind speeds at the west coast wind stations. 4 of the top 4 most rapid wind averages are all in Norway, so it's a slightly more windy place than is anywhere in Scotland. The 2 exceptions are slightly sheltered from winds from the northeast, which accounts for their slightly lower values. The geology is very similar. A very large amount of it is literally Caledonian, from the Caledonian orogeny of 400 to 1650 million years ago, and the rest of it is Precambrian, also like parts of northwest Scotland. Most of the rock is hard, volcanic, infertile, producing infertile soils, again, very similar to the Scottish Highlands. So to summarise, again, South West Norway has been largely deforested for a very long time, in coastal districts for millennia. It was caused by the cumulative effects of livestock grazing and associated land uses. The data is comprehensive. It's standardised, it's publicly available, you can find it on websites, and it's precisely quantifiable. And it indicates that the climates of the two regions are very similar. They're highly oceanic, they're mild, they're wet. Precipitation varies strongly, depending on the topography and the rain-shadow effects, and it has similar seasonal temperature ranges. If there is a difference, it's that Norway, southwest Norway, is slightly windier overall, and parts of it are wetter than anywhere in Scotland. And the geology is also very similar, hard volcanic rocks from the same mountain building phases. So given all of that, it's not surprising that this place, for example, Fidjidallan, which is on about the latitude of the Pentland Firth, looks very similar to places in West Scotland like Glencoe or Upper Glen Affric, except that it doesn't anymore. I've been in this landscape a number of times with foresters, and nearly all of the trees are actually less than 40 years old. And I've talked to the farmer that lives in the glen below, and he confirms that up to the 60s it was largely deforested. The exception is a few trees that were grown beside the old farmhouse there. And this is very much the big fact of the landscape history over the last 150 years, and particularly the last 50 years in Norway. It's happening very widespread, it's happening everywhere, and it continues now. This is Geiranger Fjord, which is in West Norway, sea level. My main point I want to draw your attention to in this map is if you see the top right of the 1885 picture, a large part of the slope there is bare rock at that time. By 1960, it had become covered in birch forest. Here's another spot, Kvenedhulla Sawmill. This is in inland Rogaland, 1890, shortly after it went out of business. There are a few trees regenerating top left, but as you can see, the wood resource is commercially extinct. And this is the same place in 2004. It's worth an aside at this point that Kvenedhulla is one of many sawmills. It sawed lumber using water power for what was called the Scottihandel. This translates literally as the Scottish trade. That is export. And this took place in the later 17th to the 19th century. It took its name from the dominance of Scotland as a destination for the timber. If you look, for example, at structural timbers in Perth, through the 1500s, they were sourced from the Highlands, and after that, they were sourced from Norway. And this trade led to further substantial declines in the remaining forests of inland southwest Norway. So here's Oslibakken near Stavanger. You've seen this picture before. That's the 1911 picture. And this is the same place today. The orange cross is roughly the point of shot of the first picture. You just see trees if you did it today. Now you can see part of the former moorland area has been turned to arable farmland. Part of it in the middle distance is commercial forest. And in the foreground, a very great deal of natural regeneration has taken place. A lot of this can happen quite quickly. This is Fonnes in Hordaland. The picture was taken in 1971. And the little copse of pine trees was planted by the farmer in 1907 and, of course, fenced off to keep the domestic stock off it. In this case, we know exactly when the grazing pressure was reduced, which is 1975. This is what it looks like in 2005. The bog in the middle, of course, is still unforested. The rest is now pine woodland. I point out the cabin in the top picture. The ridge of the roof there is about 2 meters high. Oops. Excuse me. And this effect is continuing. This is the predicted future trends in land cover. The dark green colour is the potential natural forest regeneration, almost all of which is predicted to in fact occur. And if you go to the district, and I strongly urge that you do, a lot of it is in fact there already, because the criterion in this paper of forest was trees over 2.5 metres high. But a very great deal of it is there now. In Rogaland, the southwest province here, the predicted area of forest is going to increase from 24% to 52% over the next 30 years. It's the area that was previously most completely deforested. So let's look at some statistics on that. These are two areas that are in the early stages of returning from moorland into a more wooded state. The total area of forest that was classified as productive increased in South West Norway by 55% in the 30 years 63 to 93. And I should say that productive is a forestry statistics term. It means a potential increase in harvestable timber of more than 1 metre per hectare per year, whether or not it's harvested for timber. A lot of other areas, non-productive forest, are also regenerating, so that number is an underestimate. More recently, between the two forestry inventory periods 2005 to 9 and 2010 to 14, if you annualise the area of woodland increase, it amounted to 305 square kilometres a year, or over 5 years, 2.6% of the land area. Almost all of the expansion in that period was through natural regeneration. And it's worth noting in this context that the Scottish forestry strategy for increased forest area is 17 to 25% of land cover. That's an 8% increase by 2030, or a 1,000 kilometre squared increase by 2022. And this data in an area that's 2/3 the size of Scotland suggests that's an easily achievable goal. You don't need to look at the graphs here particularly. They're the base for the following calculation when you're considering woodland in terms of its standing mass of timber and therefore carbon sequestration. The annualised increase, if you do the sums here, amounts to nearly 4 million cubic metres a year additional wood, timber. If you use the volume increase ratio of spruce to pine to deciduous timber, mostly birch in this case, and then the British Forestry Commission's conversion factors, that represents an annual sequestration of almost exactly 1 million tonnes of carbon. Now, notionally, only notionally, if you translate that into carbon dioxide weights and take the emissions auction price in the European Union for last week, that's 26.6 million euros a year. Also, it doesn't include the bark. This is timber. It doesn't include the branches, the leaves, the root system, or the soil carbon, which would be mean that the real amount sequestered would be very much larger. The Scottish Forest Strategy sequestration, by an interesting coincidence, is almost exactly 1 million tonnes of carbon per year by 2020 through woodland expansion. I should also say that because it is sometimes said that this can't happen, a very great deal of this is happening on wet peat soils. A very large amount of Norway is peat soils formed in the same way as Scottish ones, and a very great deal of our recent regeneration has taken place directly on top of soils like that, so there is no reason in principle why that cannot happen. Here, for example, is an old peat digging in regenerating birch. It's been cleared for archaeological investigation a few years before the pines that you see in the background were also in the peat digging. Now, it is true that, of course, that places that are permanently saturated, blanket bog, trees can't grow. 6% of Norway is blanket bog. It forms in the same way as blanket bog forms in Scotland. However, almost none of these places are treeless. As you can see, there are trees growing in all of the drier patches around the edges here along the river banks and anywhere where it's slightly drier. I'll skip the summary, I think. That's been rather data heavy, so let's look at how this looks when it's actually down to places. This is a place called Gorenlee in Hidrosund. It's almost exactly the same latitude as Stornoway, to be exact, Stornoway Airport runway. The geology and landforms are more like West Harris. It's a very exposed place, right out on the open coast, no intervening islands, nothing to stop the weather coming straight at it, and the weather mostly comes out of the southwest. It's very wet. Gardenlee, it's about 3 metres of rain a year. It's very mild. It's above zero all year round, and there is virtually never lying snow of any depth. And the geologies are various hard volcanic rocks leading to infertile soils. If you look at the area, and this is an area which is like West Harris, say, in its climate, except that it's rather windier, it has powerful onshore gales every winter, a force 11 every other winter, and it's had 2 hurricane force winds in the last 10 years. The last one this January was at sustained hurricane force 2 levels for several hours. Nevertheless, as you can see, it's quite a well-wooded spot. It wasn't, of course, back from the Bronze Age until about a century ago at the outside. Here it is looking the other way. If you look at the church spire in the top picture, and then look at the islet in the foreground in the bottom picture, you can just see the church spire in the background. The spray, the splash zone, is about 60 metres high on the outside there, and it extends over about 300 metres. But immediately behind it, nevertheless, is well-grown, naturally regenerated forest. Now, this area, as I said, has been deforested for a long time, and just like Scotland, you can find the dry stone buildings that result from a lack of other materials scattered about the landscape. This one, by the look of the tiles there, was used into the 17th, 18th centuries, and then probably has been used as an animal shed since. This is Gorenley itself. You can see the young woodland around it. And there it is looking out to the open sea. Where this will all end, the structure has a long way to go yet, but probably the oak tree bottom left there is the future if this is left to run for a couple of centuries. The natural vegetation, as for the west of Scotland, would be sessile oak wood dominated, and in this landscape there are quite a lot of small farms, and very generally they kept 1 or 2 trees in by around the house for amenity and shelter reasons. That's probably where quite a lot of the seed source for the woodland came from. You'll move a little inland. This is a plateau at about 350 metres. It's covered in trees. It used to have several hill farms on the site, and again, all of the trees here are under 50, 60 years old. Second example, this is Mon and Fidjadalen, which I showed you earlier. The climate is mild. The temperatures in winter hover around 0 on the valley floor, and they're only about between 5 and 10 degrees centigrade in the summer. This is a very, very wet spot indeed. It's 4 metres of rain on the valley floor and higher than that in the mountains around. The amount of snow is on average about 2 months a year at over 25 centimetres, but that varies a lot from year to year. In mild winters it's green. Hard volcanic rocks again. And to give an example of just how deforested this place used to be, we have an oral history account from one of the last inhabitants of the farm who lived there until 1914. They used to collect peat from the top of that cliff. If you've ever moved peat yourself, you'll know that that is a very considerable job. The reason they did so is that locally there isn't much peat, and of course at the time there wasn't any wood, or what there was too valuable to burn. Now, there are still animals grazed here. I've had a long conversation with the farmer that lives in the glen below, and he tells me that he runs almost 1,000 sheep in the glen each summer. That's not just the glen, it's also the mountains around about, so it's very hard to translate that into densities. But you should not get the idea that these areas are completely useless for other purposes, like, for example, keeping sheep. And sheep grow well and grow fat in sheltered areas like this. Also, a big feature in the South West Norway, there's a lot of scree slopes which formed during the period of deforestation as the soil was eroded out. These are now pretty largely being recolonised by woodland, and that is helping to hold the soil down, which has various benefits, in particular anywhere near a road. Third example is this place, Sagvatne. It's on an outer island called Bomlo. It's about the same latitude as Fair Isle. Again, a very exposed spot. The woodland comes within about 300-400 metres of the extreme outer coast, but if you went there you'd discover there's new regeneration practically down to the beach these days. At Sagvatn it's predominantly Scots pine that's reseeded, and unusually we have a lot of science for this place. Coring has been done and it shows that all the trees are less than 150 years old. Most are under 100. All of them are naturally regenerated. And this place was coastal moor from about the Bronze Age until declines in grazing pressure. These were associated with mass voluntary emigration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And it's a windy place. Here's a wind-bent aspen stand just before it comes into leaf. The extreme wind events are much the same as in the previous example, with one less hurricane-force wind. And my fourth example is a place called Buccleuch. Its climate and geology are closely similar to the central cairngorms. I'm including this to show a natural feature that is extinct in Scotland, which is the natural tree line zonation. In a natural system, you start with pine woodland, then there's an area known as the birch belt above that, in which birches but not pines grow. Above that's an area called the willow region, and then above that you get out into the open alpine zone. Just a quick sequence through them. This is the birch pine transition. Here we are about 900 metres up on a mountain in the birch zone. Above that, here's a place where the snow normally blows off. It's a ridge, and there you get dwarf birches primarily. Willow is mostly found in sheltered locations associated with snow lie. Then you have the willow zone. This is a typical piece of it. The term, I should say, means the zone where montane willows are common, not that the zone is all willow necessarily, or even dominated by them. Various other trees, dwarfed in size, are common as well. This area we know was open moor 50 years ago. The regeneration here, like in many parts of the higher regions of Norway, has followed a decline in grazing pressures again. There are still cows and sheep here, and there are also moose and reindeer, but the densities are sufficiently low that regeneration is not inhibited. And then eventually you get out onto the high plateau. This area, incidentally, is the Avimore of South West Norway. The top station there is almost exactly the height of the Ptarmigan station on Cairngorm, and it's a similar lump of granite. The main difference is that instead of snow fences having to be put in to contain the snow in the runs, the service is provided by naturally sown woodland. So, there we are. That's what the land looks like now. How is it used? Landbruk is the Norwegian word for land use. And I had a lot of trouble trying to work out how to translate this. It's a central concept if you want to understand how land is used in rural Norway. It literally translates as land use, but it's usually translated into English as farming or agriculture, but this can be misleading. Farming and agriculture are certainly very important central parts of it, but it is a wider concept. It means making a living from the land, and most usually from diverse sources. Usually there will be several income generating activities on any given piece of land. Typically the landowner is an owner-occupier. And one of the very large differences from Scotland is that land ownership is very dispersed in Norway. This graph, or this map, shows the number of land use properties per 5 kilometre grid square, or 25 square kilometres. In the areas that are better for farming, you're at over 76. Even the areas, this lowest category is 12 or fewer, which would be less than 1 per 2 kilometres. If you were doing a similar map in Scotland, obviously the scale would have to be rather different. As in most of the rest of Europe, the size of farms has been growing. If you look at the graph here, the left is 1969, the right is 2011. Back in 1969, when you're talking about in-buy fields, the average farm was about 5 hectares. Now it's about 25. But there are still over 200,000 farm units in Norway, or land use units to be more exact. And in most cases, farmland and woodland are combined. The same individual farmer and his family will be using both the farmland itself and exploiting the woodland behind for various purposes. The amount of farmland, even though the number of farms has declined somewhat, has in fact risen considerably over the last 40 years or so as areas of moorland have been taken into use for farming. The overall increase is about 300 square kilometres in South West Norway. Nearly all of that in Rogaland, because that's where the moorland is of sufficient quality to justify the effort. In the other two regions, the amount of fields in production has declined slightly. This is really an effect of some very small areas of fields going out in remote places going out of production. So if you look at a farm owner's income by source, this is the owner. The pay from external employment is a very serious part of it. It's 43% of income on average. Farmers will vary from full-time farmers to people who do it on a less than full-time basis. But the farm is kind of a nexus, I suppose you could say. It's not just this man. Very typically, other members of his family will work the farm, and they'll also have external incomes. So in South West Norway, it's more normal to have a very diversified source of income and for farms to be worked by a number of people. The picture bottom right shows farmers on a rather high quality farm posed by their current nuclear families in a discussion on the Norwegian land use site on inheritance issues. If you look at this from the perspective of woodland, 120,000 or so Norwegians own woodland. That's 1 in 40 of the entire population. The average property is relatively small by Scottish standards, 58 hectares. 97% of the owners are private individuals. They own 80% of the area. The other 20% is forestry companies and so on. Forestry employs 3,900 full-time equivalents in direct harvesting, 22,000 in the wider industry. But that's an underestimate because remember the Landbruk farm woodland owners are also doing quite a lot of work there themselves. Ownership is almost entirely local. This is a typical commune in Norway. A commune would be, if Scotland were Norway, places like Athol or Lorne would be communes. Nearly 80% of the owners are individuals resident in Orkdal commune. Only 6% are non-residents. The rest is companies, government bodies, and one nature reserve. Now, these forest properties are generally small, but the way they're exploited is through forestry cooperatives. Most owners belong to these cooperatives. This does the bulk of timber management, harvesting and sales, which allows modern equipment to be used, other economies of scale. But for other purposes, the landowner generally will use the place individually. If you look at these non-timber sources of income, sales of hunting and fishing rights are important. I'll return to that later. Cabin rental and sale of cabin plots is very significant. That's another Norwegian habit. And other income including fuel wood, which is now completely replaced peat. Peat was still used into the 1980s in some outlying islands, is another significant factor. And the overall result of this form of land use is that the population densities in southwest Norway are considerably higher than in the Highlands. Sometimes I hear from people in Scotland, of course you can do that because you've got these massive areas of wilderness. In fact, southwest Norway is considerably more crowded than Highland Scotland in terms of its population. This is the overall densities. If you subtract the major urban centres, the effect persists. So, another recap. South West Norway is closely similar in the basic conditions of life to Highland Scotland, and there is comprehensive data which demonstrates this. It was formerly strongly deforested, in coastal regions almost completely so from the Bronze Age. It has reforested, largely through natural regeneration, since the late 19th century, and especially since the 1950s. Research demonstrates that this has been a result of the reduction in grazing intensities and associated land uses. This reforestation is continuing at a rapid rate. Much of it's occurring on wet peat soils, which formed during the forested period, and this includes hard, infertile rock types in very wet, mild and windy ocean edge locations, including places that are demonstrably windier than anywhere in Scotland on the coast. But it was, and it is, a working cultural landscape. None of this is wilderness. All of it has been used by people for millennia. The land use is diversified. Typically, you get multiple income streams from the same property. Most land is privately owned. Owner occupation is typical, and government policy strongly encourages this. Land group properties are much smaller than the typical holding in Scotland, most an element in a wider family income, and the overall population density on the land is higher, considerably higher than in Highland Scotland. So, in the final section of this talk, that's all been a bit dry, I think. I want to try and get some impression of the flavour of what this is to live in. Here are, again, two areas in southwest Norway, both of them on roughly the same latitude as the north coast of Scotland. What's it used for? Well, forestry. Like we said, much woodland is in clear fell rotation for timber, as its primary use anyway. However, much is also in mixed use for timber, firewood, grazing, hunting, forest products. In this form of management, the trees are felled in very small cuts or even individually by the landowner. It's a thing to do in the winter, and this results in a more varied woodland structure. You can also use it for grazing. This is my friend Jon E. Truen, who's a sheep owner who was kind enough to let me work on his sheep. There are about 450,000 sheep in southwest Norway in the summer, and they mostly graze in through woodland up onto the mountain tops. They are let out. On the coast, they're out all year. Inland, they are grazed seasonally. You can keep cows, dairy and beef. Hunting. In southwest Norway, the main targets are grouse and red deer. The guy in the two pictures on the right is my colleague Erling Solberg, who runs much of the data monitoring system on which management decisions for the deer population in Norway are based. The decisions are largely taken at communal level. Plus other colleagues from work in the background. I was along as fifth assistant dragger. This is very much, Norway is very much a hunting culture. Nearly 500,000 Norwegians are registered hunters. That means they have been through the rather stringent examination. Of those, 200,000 or so paid the annual hunting licence fee, which you pay to the government and which pays for the game management system. That means they intended to go hunting that year. Almost all of the people who paid that were Norwegian. 9% of adult males paid the fee. When hunting season comes along at work, I'm suddenly practically alone. Everyone else has gone off. The game resource is a public asset, which is the same as in Scotland. The hunting rights are owned by the landowner, as in Scotland. Management's through a publicly accountable system in which government, communities, landowners and hunters have clearly defined roles. Red roe deer and grouse are the main game species in southwest Norway. So I'll digress for a moment here to have a look at red deer management at the moment, since that's an issue in Scotland. Red deer mostly are found in the west and southwest of the country. The number of deer shot each year has been going up along with the population, but as of the 2010 to 11 hunting season, the number of animals shot each year has declined, and that's due to a managed reduction in the population. There were reasons for doing this. The main one was that the carcass weights, the body condition, and the calving percentages all started to decline. We have data, comprehensive data is collected on all of these subjects in Norway. And the reason for it was incipient competition for food. This indicated that the population had risen to a point beyond that optimal for harvest purposes, and also an animal welfare issue. A second reason was reducing road accident risks. The number of cars in Norway is going up, the number of deer is going up, the number of collisions were going up. Quite apart from the human tragedy involved, vehicle collision is a very expensive proposition. And a third reason was reducing negative impacts on forestry and agriculture. And here's the data so far. It's beginning to look as if this approach is working. The last ones there are the data for 2015 so far. So this is subject to review later on, but the stag, weights of adult stags, that's the 2.5, meaning 2.5 years old or more, looks as if it's responding. So less strongly are both 1.5-year-old stags and 1.5-year-old hinds in Norway. It's worth pointing out in this connection that Norwegian deer are very much heavier than Scottish ones, and the data is clear that this is not for genetic reasons. Gathering. This is another thing Norwegians like to do. Berries, fungi and common flowers can all be picked. It's part of what's called every man's right in Norway. So here's my wife and son out exercising our constitutional rights. And this has actually got some economic significance. These are the bins at my local supermarket at the beginning of berry season. This is all berry picking equipment, including cute frog-shaped ones for your kids. This is how they're used. Mushrooming in season is also big. Fuel wood, a large and sustainable industry in Norway. Either just a few trees taken out using this bit of equipment which you can buy in the equivalent of B&Q in Norway, or considerable commercial operations. The 2009 household fuel wood consumption was 1,600,000 tonnes, which is 816 kilograms per household. And that's obviously not evenly distributed. So here's one of the farmers, the landbruker, with his product for sale. The declared income from fuel wood was 323 million kroner. I say declared because when I've bought from farmers, it's always been strictly cash. Education. Using the land isn't just commercial exploitation. Kindergartens start at the bottom of the age spectrum. All kindergartens often go into excursions into the woods. About a third of them are nature kindergartens, outdoors all day in most weathers. My son went to one of these kindergartens. This is him and his chums heading off into the woods at the beginning of the day. And that's him looking at the camera on his way back in the evening. This continues throughout the period of compulsory education. It's a requirement, a legal requirement, that whole days out are part of the school curriculum, and there are also camp schools. Cabins. This is another great feature of Norwegian life. There were one cabin to every 12 inhabitants back in 2009. There are cabins for every architectural taste and to suit every pocket. And it's a considerable industry. In the In-Flight magazine internally in Norway, and I was flying yesterday, there was an advertisement for cabin designs, and this is from one of the websites of the several companies that supply manufactured cabins. Hiking and rambling is another central Norwegian feature. 5% of the population are members of the Hikers Association. That's bigger proportionately than the RSPB in Britain. Fishing, by the way, is free for anyone under 16 in Norway, which is, until my son turned 16 last week, why he did the fishing when we went out hiking. This is, and there are of course many other ways of enjoying the outdoors. A phrase in Norwegian, probably the most cliched phrase in the whole of Norwegian, is this one: ut på tur, aldri sur, which translates much better into Scots than into English. Ut on tur, never sur. If you Google that exact phrase, you'll get 392,000 hits. So, to finish, and really my overall point, these two landscapes, which you saw at the start of this sequence, every single one of the economic and social activities that I have just shown you go on in these landscapes. In the left, with the addition of arable farming; on the right, not including grazing cattle. Not so long ago, they looked like this. Rough grazing, in both cases, was the only economic use of significance. Now, there is no biophysical reason why similar things cannot happen in Scotland. The rest is choices. Thank you.
Wow. Well, that was great. You do leave us on a bit of a cliffhanger, though, you know, because I wonder if you could speculate a wee bit then, well, it's not even speculating because you researched it, on the kind of comparison with Scotland then, because is it just the presence of tiny teeth? You know, what is it that keeps our barren area looking like these places in 1917?
Well, this is an area, of course, of considerable controversy, so I'll jump straight in. It's primarily to do with grazing pressure and associated land uses like muir burn. There is a secondary issue as to the seed source. The seed bank may be depleted, though current work being done in some of the properties bought by Mr. Anders Poulsen is showing that actually there's a surprising large amount out there, but it gets nibbled down the minute it gets above heather level. So it is. The other thing with Norway is there is a strong impression that this started slowly and has accelerated. However, I cannot give you scientific evidence to prove that point, because this has not been a subject that anyone has been concerned to research in Norway. It's perfectly possible to research it, but in Norway, lack of trees is not currently regarded as our problem. Indeed, if there is a significant problem, regarded problem is that there's too much regeneration, on the lines of when I was a kid. You get a great view of the fjord from here, but you can't see it now for all those trees. This seems to be fading a little bit now as more and more people's childhood memories include trees. But the biology of this is really relatively simple. Except in areas that are saturated all the time, blanket bog, trees can and will regenerate throughout the land mass of Scotland. If they can regrow in places like Hidresund, which you saw, then they can regrow on West Harris, for example. So biologically, there is no impediment. It might be well worth kick-starting it by seeding, since the seed bank may be depleted, but the basic biology is not really in doubt.
Yeah, that's kind of basic economics, because, I mean, the Norwegians, and I'm trying to think of something that Professor Otto Brock sent to me once, where he said that the Norwegians were the last Marists. He had no connection with John MacDonald at all, but what he was meaning is the emphasis on family farms and the belief in this family size of farm. Now that's a different kind of economic policy, isn't it, to support that than we've got here?
Yeah, well, I am a biologist, so here my opinion, I make no pretense to it being particularly informed. I am telling you that this is biologically possible to do it. If it's biologically impossible, then it's over to you in Scotland. You have a democracy with full powers, and it's up to you to decide. It is up to you to decide collectively what it is that you want from your landscape. So really I have to leave that to you. The economics, I once heard, and this is a very polemical point, I am not making it myself, someone misquoting Calgacus, that the modern Scottish grouse moor, they make a desert and call it the backbone of the rural economy. I am not saying that. I am saying that the income streams, economics is a very complex discipline. The income streams as stated in one way can be relatively large. The income streams stated in another way can be relatively small. For example, the capital values of estates in the Highlands are relatively large. How much of that feeds through to the local community rather than being transferred between owners? This is a complex point. I am not an economist, and it's an inherently political matter. But there is no practical reason why this could not be done. Further, there are a number of different income streams. Doing this does not exclude hunting. Hunting is widespread in Norway. It is true that you could not hope to get bags of the size that modern intensive grouse rearing does in Scotland, but then that's the equivalent. That's a very strongly managed for one exact product. You could argue that the quality of the hunting is considerably higher, but that is a matter of taste. But it doesn't exclude it. You can do hunting there. You can do grazing there. You can do kindergartens there, all on the same ground. You can extract fuel wood. You can extract timber. How this whole mix feeds through, and part of it I'm reasonably sure is to do with the land ownership. The people here are connected to the land. They have been generally for generations. They intend to pass it on to the next generation. They'll use it for hunting themselves, very typically. When you live on a relatively small patch of land, the complexity that you can manage it at tends to increase.
Yep, and just for everybody else while he's in here, the tiny teeth, are those, because you can't, apart from hunting, you can't really control deer movements as easily unless you're going to stick up big deer fences. Is it that there have been more sheep in Norway? I mean, what is it that's actually decreased in Norway that's allowed the regrowth to happen?
I thought of calling this talk Abraham Lincoln and the Regeneration of Norwegian Woodland, just to be very recondite. In 1860, Lincoln became President of the United States. This led to the secession of the South, and that led directly to what's called the Homestead Act of 1862. The South had been blocking it because they were worried about more free states being admitted to the Union. It indeed had the effect expected. It gave a quarter of a square mile free land to anyone who went to claim it. Norwegians were literate. There were steamships available, and living on this land was not at all easy. Around about a third of the population left over the period up to the First World War. This removed the landless labourer class in Norway. It reduced the grazing pressure, and a very great deal, in fact almost all of the regeneration, dates initially from that period. Then, in the 1950s, other ways of making a living got to be increasingly available, and they are much less hard ways of making life. Also, people wanted to move away from these remote fill farms to places that had electricity, phone lines, and a generally higher standard of living. This led to a second decline. These areas are still used. They're still used for grazing, but the intensity declined considerably, and the data shows that it is the decline in grazing pressure and the associated activities, like muir burn, like fuel wood use, that has been the reason for the regeneration of the forest. The natural regeneration, none of it's been planned, it's just happened.
Right, last question from me. Your accent is just really intriguing me. Are you from Caithness?
No, I'm from Dundee.
Wrong. Right, and just to let everybody know, you're actually now a Norwegian citizen?
Yes, I've been in Norway. I went to Norway for 1 year, 22 years ago. I'm now a citizen, and before people start asking me detailed questions, John Major was Prime Minister when I left. A lot has happened. My expertise is more Norway than Scotland.
Right. Okay, but mercifully, our English is pretty good. So, right, questions, folks. Just fire away. And actually, because it helps for those who are still with us, hello, on the streaming, it helps if you use these buttons on the speakers that are sitting in front of everybody here. And if you're sitting behind folk, just lean in, embrace your inner Italian big time, just welly into that space, and let's get questions. Come on, folks. They're stunned, but come on. Yep, there's a gentleman there. Can you lean into and switch on one of those thingies? No.
Thank you.
Let us know who you are if you feel it's relevant.
Am I on? Yes. My name's John Brand. I'm just an interested citizen, no particular connection except that I spent some time in Norway last year. I'm very interested because I don't quite understand. It seems that the crucial point in all of this is the restriction of grazing, or the diminution of grazing, but that the regeneration is natural, albeit perhaps with little help. So that seems to suggest that there's a long period during which the land is actually economically, in one sense, unproductive, because you're waiting for it to regenerate and nothing else much is happening on it, because you can't graze on it. Perhaps you can do it hunting and so on. Norway, I guess, can afford this sort of thing because it has a great deal of spare cash. But how would we do it in Scotland?
Well, first of all, Norway was not a rich country when most of this was happening. It's been happening through the oil was discovered in the 1970s. Before that, Norway was not a particularly well-off country, but this effect was well underway by that time. The land was used throughout. It's just that grazing pressures for various economic reasons unrelated to any intention of doing this had led to a reduction in the intensity of use. It was used for hunting throughout the period. In Scotland, you are talking about a rather complex social situation, which I am not a particular expert in. There does not seem to me the amount, if I have been 22 years out of Scotland, and in fact quite a lot of change in the woodland has happened in this time. If you go to the Cairngorms, which I was very familiar with in the turn of the 80s and 90s, I lived there for 2 years, the difference now is very strong. A very great deal of regeneration is taking place because various landowners, public and private, have decided that that's a goal that they wish to achieve. It requires a change in thinking, certainly, as to what these lands can beneficially be used for, and it's a matter of social decision. The game resource in Scotland, as in Norway, is not privately owned. It's a public resource. The hunting is private, the rights to hunting are private, but the resource itself is a public resource and it is managed in that manner for various complex reasons, hunting included, but also other factors in Norway. It's a matter for public policy as to whether you manage in that manner. It's perfectly reasonable for someone to say that they like the land open the way it is. I would personally disagree, but it's a perfectly reasonable point. It's not, however, open to say that there is no alternative.
Okay, can I just say to anybody who's still with us on the streaming, if there's any question you want to ask, you could do that by Twitter, by just putting in a question to @Nordic Horizons. And Chris, are you on the case at the back? Right, so put your hand up if you get one. And I think you can also post something on the Facebook page if you can keep across that as well. Right, do you feel that was completely answered? Come on, you can be tough if you want. He's from Dundee, for goodness sake, come on.
Yes, I think so. It does imply quite a lot of common consent. That's the point I'm making.
Okay, right, yourself.
Yeah, I'm very interested in the natural regeneration of the forest as it comes on, but I noticed a lot of it's coming on very steep ground, and it also has to be taken out at some point, commercially harvested. Are they making any provision for extraction when they're going for infrastructure, for roads? Because all that stuff would have to come out by Skyliner and, you know, roads. I'm very interested. It's a remote area. Do they make a provision for that, or they just wait it come in and they say, right, we'll knock roads in?
Well, back in the 1930s, and I am not joking, Norwegian's government and the Norwegian people were seriously concerned that the entire country would become completely deforested in short order. A large amount of the woodland has been, or a significant amount, especially outside the southwest, are planted commercial forests. It's not quite like Scotland because there are no deer fences, and generally the regeneration is natural. It's part of the Norwegian forest law, in fact, that provision for natural regeneration must be ensured whenever any trees are felled. So in the more productive areas, and this does include some areas of the southwest, trees are grown in an intensively managed manner. They are cut in large swathes, and then generally a few trees are left to reseed the ground. Other areas are less like that. Some are so steep that even Norwegians can't harvest them. On the other hand, the places that we can harvest are sometimes quite staggeringly surprising. I've seen some operations at work where areas on fjord sides that look impossible are being harvested through skylines. It's, in the end, an economic question as to whether it is worth taking trees out of these areas. If it is economically worth doing it, there is certainly no barrier to doing it, except in a few areas that are protected because they're old forest, for example. Overall, our forest business is now doing quite well, partly because the exchange rate has changed very favourably from their point of view since the oil price declined. So that comes to a matter of economics, but Norwegians are, I think I would say, generally not a sentimental people when it comes to exploiting nature. If it's a harvestable economic resource, it will be harvested, and that's not controversial.
So if we were going in Scotland for the goal that we have for going was it up to 50% or whatever it was in the next couple of years, the forestry targets, could we do that by removing the number of sheep, lowering the number of sheep, and then letting it regenerate?
In principle, yes.
How long would it take, do you think?
That's harder.
Ish.
If you're close to a good seed source, it can happen quite quickly. I don't know how many people who are here are familiar with, say, the Muir of Dinnet.
Oh,
I have a snapshot memory. I was on holiday there when I was 4. Back then,
Deeside, folks.
It's Deeside, near Aboyne. It back then was moorland, though I remember a few tiny birches. If you go there now, it's mature woodland. All of that regenerated naturally because the land use practices, which I think previously it was grouse moor, changed. Where you've got a decent seed source, this can happen very quickly. If you don't have a decent seed source, then this may take longer, but it would be possible to kick-start it. And you can see this I drove recently along the road from Inverness to Ullapool, which I hadn't been on for 22 years, and it's now got quite a lot of woodland of a semi-natural nature regenerating behind deer fences. Were the grazing pressure around these places to go off, then the same thing would happen outside the deer fence as in it. You may have taken the railway line up from Perth to Inverness, going over Drumochter. They have to cut the trees down on the inside of the fence there regularly. Outside it, there are no trees. The reason is entirely to do with the grazing pressure. So in principle, yes. The period of time, that is a much more difficult one to answer and goes down to rather more complex factors.
Right, yes, yourself. And could I just say welcome to the MSPs who we've got with us for the time. I can see Mike, Christian, and obviously Rob. Forgive me if I'm missing other people that I can't see well, but do feel that you can ask whatever you'd like. But the lady here first.
Yes, this bears on the point you made about the ability to manage complexity. That was in your mind related to scale. And I understood that to mean if I owned 1,000 acres, I would be less attentive to the complexity of the land than if I owned 100.
To a certain extent, if you, 1,000 hectares is reasonably manageable. That's 10 square kilometres in some ways, if you live there permanently. Give you an example, I think Glen Tanner Estate is around about that size. I may be underestimating it considerably, but I would myself say that that's a very well managed place. It's got interestingly complex woodland, and it's being managed for a number of different income streams. The problem essentially, I think, partly comes down to residence. If this is your place where you live and you expect to pass it on to the next generation, your kids go to school, it's an entirely different proposition, I think, mentally, from if you are a person who lives a great distance away and this is one of many things that you do, where you will probably want it to be relatively simple for you to deal with.
Yeah, thank you for that. So there's no optimal size of land in that sense. It has to do with ownership and residence, as well as the amount of land.
I would say so, but I am moving here out of my area of professional expertise.
Well, you see, if you're doing a monocropping, if you're just going to grow soy, there's an optimal size. And the more technology you can bring to bear to 100,000 acres in the Pampas of Argentina, the cheaper will be the unit price of the soy. This is very different kind of land use that you're describing. And that's why I asked the question. If regeneration were the objective rather than income, then for regeneration there would have to be some thought given to who lives on how much.
Yes, it's also worth pointing out that very many areas of the Highlands are not actually managed for income generation. They're managed for other purposes. So again, for example, they're managed for, what would you call it? Recreational purposes for the owner.
And status purposes.
Essentially, yes. Everyone does this. I'm sure I do that to a certain extent myself. Whether it's a reasonable use for the majority of the land area of Scotland is a matter for the people in this room and the wider population of Scotland.
Okay, Mike, can you come forward to the microphone? And just leave that one on. Thanks, lass.
Thanks. I'm Mike Mackenzie, MSP, represent the Highlands and Islands region. What I'm interested in a way it follows on from that last question, because I'm interested in locally added value. In what respect the benefits of wild foresting, if you like, and that form of land management that you described benefits the local rural economy. And just by way of contrast, to explain what I mean, Argyll Butte, where I live, has, I think, something of the order of 30% of Scotland's forests, virtually all of which in Argyll Butte are spruce plantations. And when I was a young builder in a previous occupation, there were still 6 or so small local sawmills. These have all gone since then. So there is virtually no local added value, and the last time I looked at prices for sawn logs that are exported out of Argyll Butte from these low quality spruce plantations, it was something of the order of £30 per tonne, giving rise to a lot of local complaint because of the wear and tear of the roads, but with very, very little residual and local added value. So I'm very interested to hear if things are done differently in Norway and how they are done in Norway.
Again, first you should ask a forestry expert from Norway to come and address you. That's a considerably complex question. Nearly all of the woodland in Norway, or the vast majority of it, is privately owned by individuals, not by companies. This means that any of the profits accrued then go down into the local community. Local communities in Norway are, it seems to me, very much stronger as cohesive units than is typically the case in Scotland, with the exception of some crofting areas. The commune is a place of real power. A lot of real decisions are made there. People are generally in rural districts quite familiar with the people that wield that power because the population is generally a few thousand. So the links are stronger. Also, there is no history of large uprootings of population. There's been large emigration. Norway claims to have had a larger proportion of its population immigrate than any other country in the world. But that was pull mostly rather than push, and certainly none of it was forcible. So you don't have the dislocations. The people that live on farms now very typically are able to trace their occupation as a family on the farm back for centuries. So there's a rootedness in the local community. People, of course, come in, people move out, but the core of the community has a much longer legacy. Therefore, they get the income stream because they own it physically. They own most of the commune as private individuals, and most of the income then goes in to things that happen in the commune. So while the basic biological conditions are the same, socially speaking, the two areas could hardly be more different. The social history has been very different. My impression from living 29 years in Scotland and 22 years in Norway is that as individuals, Norwegians are neither cleverer nor more moral than Scotsmen. So there has to be some other reason for this state of affairs. I don't think it's beyond the wit of people, assuming that you think the way the Norwegians live their rural lives is preferable, to move in that direction with obvious Scottish characteristics. It is a different culture. But it's a matter for you, rather than me, to decide how that's best done. I know it sounds like a cop-out, but I'm a Norwegian now. I'm doing my bit for the old country.
Right, this kind of hurts all of this actually, but right, Andy, can I bring Andy in, and then we've got 3 questions coming from our stream viewers.
Good to know. Andy White, thanks very much, Duncan, that's fascinating. I just want to make one observation really, and that's to do with, you talk about choices. I mean, in forestry, we don't, I put out a tweet saying that 1 in 40 Norwegians is a forest owner. You reported that earlier. The fact is we don't know in Scotland because we don't even gather any data. We've no idea who owns Scotland's forests or how it's changed over time. And that seems to me kind of fundamental in terms of making any choices. You need some information, and you need some baselines, and you need some targets, as it were, to where you want to go. And at the moment we don't have any information, official statistics on these matters. And I noticed when I was looking at Norwegian forest statistics recently, it told me lots of stuff about the gender of forest owners and stuff like that, which we don't really have. So I want to, to what extent is land use statistics important in your work?
Before you answer, and while you're still there, and probably wearing a suit because he's actually on the box tonight, and will probably lamp out at some point, what roughly is the breakdown, do you think, in Scotland of forestry ownership?
In terms of the 1 in 40?
Yeah, I mean, the Forestry Commission in Scotland, how much of the total does it own?
Well, Scottish ministers own about 1.6 million acres of land, and then there's another 1 million acres or so that's owned privately.
Rob is saying that's a third, Forestry Commission Scotland, roughly, is that right?
Private forests are 2/3.
Right.
Oh, okay, right. Yes, but most of it, I mean, I did some studies on a sample basis, so more than half is owned by absentee owners, 70% of whom don't even live in Scotland.
What was you, John?
Well, the point on statistics, In preparing this talk, it was easy for me because all I have to do is go to the Statistics Norway website. Much of it's in English. I would suggest that you go and have a look brutally to show you how it ought to be done. Even The Economist agrees with me on this one. These things are matters of public interest. They are publicly available in an easily available platform. There is no reason why that can't be the case in Scotland as well. To give you an example, the deer statistics that I showed you, the map of weights, the weights for Scottish ones are actually from one estate. I should probably have mentioned that. It is on the graph. The reason being that there is no statistic in Scotland. I managed to get information from Abernethy Estate in this case. In Norway, I go to either the wild deer register, which is on the internet. It took me about 2 minutes to get the data, or I could have done it through Statistics Norway website. If you don't know what you've got, you can't manage it properly. That would be what Norwegians would say. So one of the problems in Scotland, I would suggest, is that, yes, you don't know what you've got and you don't know who owns it.
Right, we're looking for some laughs soon. Okay, well, Chris or Jared, who's got the questions?
I've one here
right.
from the live stream.
Can we hear you?
Can you hear me? It's from Eloise Smith-Foster. Thank you, guys. Great presentations, she says. I wasn't clear on how common land is governed in Norway and decisions made over land use. Is it local authorities and community groups deciding together?
Do you want? Are there a couple? I mean, maybe
that's all I've got from the live stream.
Have you got any other ones, Chris?
Yeah, but the transfer is going mad, so saying Andy's tweeting inside the meeting, so the little jokes going on there. Get on to Nordic Horizons. First one is from Forest Land. Great.
Chris, sorry about this. Can you actually put a microphone on just so that people in the streaming can hear it?
Right, can you hear me in the stream? Nod your head. Good. So Forest Land says, great. You say trees are being browsed once they grow above heather in Scotland, where grazing is already reduced. Why? The next question is, does Duncan think that savoury, holistic grazing management, increasing livestock, can be compatible with reforesting? And what about bracken inhibiting tree regeneration? Question mark. And finally, for Andy, if we tried that on the braes above, the rest would be thankful, and similar roads, ... question mark.
Right, well, there's quite a lot in there then. So there's the question about common land, or at least the communa, which are the kind of agency that is the unit that we don't have really, which is another entire talk in itself, but I'm sure Duncan can rise to the occasion briefly. The savoury holistic stuff went right over my head, and also the question of bracken inhibiting, and there was another one there that I didn't get either, but you will have done, so let's go to it.
Right, we'll start with can you remind me of the first?
Well, the first one, I think, well, that was from you, Jerry. I think that was really, what do you mean by the commune, the commune
right.
that owns the land? That
well, the commune doesn't own the land. Virtually all of the land is in private ownership. There are two exceptions. One is local common land. It's relatively small in scale in South West Norway. These go to traditional rights to grazing and so on, and they vary a great deal in the details of how they are managed. So it defies summary. Each one will have its own unique characteristics. There's also a thing called a statsallmenning, or state common. This dates from a time in the past where the government declared that any bit of land that no one else owned was owned by it. Large parts of the north of Norway are statsallmenning, very little of southwest Norway is. So you are here talking about a landscape which, apart from some of the high mountain plateaus, almost all of it is in private ownership. Certainly well over 90%. But sometimes the problem I have with explaining Norway is that the frameworks of thought in Scotland or in Britain are different, and it can be difficult to get across. Norwegians are both highly individualistic and really quite communally minded at the same time. How this divides defies easy ability to say. I've now been there long enough that I kind of know where it kicks in if you give me a for instance, but to explain it now is very hard to do. But the basic principle is that virtually all of the land is in individual private ownership rather than by companies. Most of it is owned by people who live locally, and most of it is exploited by them for their personal benefit.
And in case I sort of slightly misread that question, it could also refer to, you mentioned, when hunting is being, when they're deciding how many deer to shoot, basically, that's something that's taken as at a communal level.
This is complex. If you look at the, again, if you look, anyone who wants a comprehensive answer to this, myself and Erling Solberg contributed a succinct description of how the hunting management system works to Land Matters website. So if you go there, you will find it there. An interesting feature was when I was asked to do this, I went to the Department of Environment website to find out how this was done. There was nothing there. No one has ever published a description of who does what, because everyone knows. So I had to do it myself with my colleague Erling, who is a serious expert on this issue, and then I checked it with the Department of Environment, said, is there anything wrong here in this description? And they said no. The data is collected in a number of ways. Hunters, for example, are often required to contribute one side of the jaw of animals that are shot. That can be used to show the condition of the animal, the age of the animal, and so on. That's one of the metrics that we use. That is collected and sent to the Department for Nature Management, and then that is sent on to NINA. We do the work for them under contract. That tells us what the condition of the population is. Most of the decisions on harvests are made in the commune, and it's made like this. The land is cut up into areas which are called valds or hunting beats. The commune then says, inside this vald, you can shoot 3 male and 2 female red deer. You are generally expected to make that quota, and it's adjusted to try and achieve the target. It can be biased higher in places where you've got a problem with road accidents, for example, but the result is done locally. Because most of the people live locally, it's their kids that are going to be negatively affected by, for example, a school bus colliding with a car, one of the cars that takes them to school. If there's any damage being caused to forestry, it's the local farmer, the guy who actually owns the hunting rights, that's going to bear the brunt of that. So this makes it a whole lot easier to obtain consensus. Now, there are disagreements, but it's generally bad farming practice to, for example, not make your quota properly. It's like having thistles in your field. A lot of this is mediated by informal social things. There are sanctions available, but I asked Erling once if he'd ever known them be invoked. For example, hunters being sent in to shoot in a place, and he said he couldn't recall an incident of it. That doesn't mean it hasn't happened somewhere. So this, again, the local management goes down to the fact that it's the local community that gets the benefits from the hunting. It's the local community that bears any problems from it. And in Norway also, hunting is harvest. Trophy, it's not socially acceptable to say you're doing it for a trophy head. Remarkably, if you do shoot a really good head, it does tend to end up on your wall, but the purpose is meat. The official purpose, and it's a harvest purpose. And the whole of the ethos of hunting very much goes to that.
Right, you skipped manfully over savoury, holistic something, and the bracken.
Right, I have to apologise. The savoury, holistic, I don't understand the term. If it means what you could call organic, then that's an increasing feature of Norwegian production, just like other places. Bracken doesn't seem to be a problem in South West Norway. It exists, but trees seem to grow through it. We don't seem to have these enormous great swards of it. the climate is pretty much the same. There's an area that might repay comparative research. I'm not a botanist and I'm not shilling for work for me, but it does, a subsidiary point I could make is that an awful lot of the questions, scientific style questions that are made in Scotland on these issues, could usefully be informed by comparative research in a place like South West Norway. I've come across a lot of cases where I've been reading things which I know cannot be true, because in Norway, facts on the ground contradict a thing that the theory in Scotland says can't be happening.
Righty. Yes, gentleman there.
Thank you. Fantastic talk. As you can see from my badge, I sort of am involved with the RSPB, so Abernethy Forest, which you've already mentioned, which is one of our nature reserves. But can I develop the hunting, sporting, decision-making process just a little? Because in essence, in Scotland, a relatively small number of people, underpinned by voluntary arrangements, decide culls over quite large areas of lands of deer. And in essence, you have to be a participant in that process to be around the table to do it. And I think, if I'm right from what you've described, there's more information about data, the animals, the numbers, the cull levels, the health of the animals, which is often unavailable to us in Scotland to make wise decisions, if I can put it like that. And the other thing that you described was a much more community-based and open system with farming, forestry, public safety in terms of road traffic accidents and so forth, all factored in terms of how then a decision is made. And again, you know, there's a disconnect in many Scottish situations, and I speak as an organisation that we do sit on some deer management groups, and it is, you know, glacially slow sometimes to address the numbers, as it is voluntary, and there's very little incentive for some people to actually reduce the overall numbers of animals that they have, which is suppressing the regeneration that you talked about, because the incentive, if it's anything, is to keep the numbers up for their specific purpose of why they hold that estate. So it's about regulation
Can you just
and management.
people who don't quite know that, can you just elaborate a little bit on the relationship between keeping up numbers and the value of an estate?
Absolutely. I mean, in a sense, that many estates, if they have a deer focus, they have to balance the availability of the number of deer, both the trophies and the hind cull, to make it financially viable to sell that on a basis that it's not too difficult in effect to get animals. So the number that are sustained on a particular piece of ground, and it may be a very extensive piece of ground, are higher than will allow natural regeneration. And then the capital values of such properties are measured in stags, hinds, grouse, etc., etc. So what that does is, if you come at it from that sectoral perspective, you are thinking about it from that alone. And the wider community interest, the impact on the natural environment, health and safety, all those things, it's only now that the margins being considered. And it's around regulation, data to make decisions and some of that. And if you could elaborate a bit more, that'd be really good.
I just want to say, because there'll be a lot of people, I think, watching this who are just a bit slack-jawed at hearing now what our normal is. Because what you've described, I mean, Rob was sort of shaking his head in the midst of all this as well, because he's been through it. But it's the extraordinary thing that you're saying there is a kind of planned over supply of deer to make it easier to shoot them, and then it also affects the actual value of the sporting estate. That's where we live, folks. Rob, if you want to come in on this one as well, because it seems to be talking comparatively, so do feel you can come in now, Rob, if you want.
I think it's appropriate to say that the attempts to try and reduce the number of deer so that we get back in some balance, that the biodiversity of the country is beginning to be tackled, because red deer are one of the biggest problems that we have in terms of the balance of nature. And the fact is that we start from having to manage these large landownings who have shooting estates. It's a fact that most of them work in deer management groups, which have, by the last 30 years, supposed to have plans which begin to manage the amount of deer that are there. But when they were starting to talk about this, it was 150,000 deer in Scotland at that time. It's about 350,000 to 400,000 deer now. And we haven't got a grip on this. So the Rural Affairs Climate Change and Environment Committee decided that we wanted much tougher approaches, and the ministers at the beginning of 2014 said that by 2016 the deer management groups have got to have plans in place and working to make sure that this number of deer is fit for the carrying capacity of that particular part of the country. Obviously it's much lower in the North West Highlands than it is in central Scotland, but all of that suggests to us that it's just approaching things from exactly the opposite direction to what we're hearing about the kind of obvious hands-on management in Norway.
I'm sorry to jeopardise your voice even more. There's some excellent pastoral things there to Rob. Right. The other obvious big difference is that even if that is all enacted, it won't be to the benefit of local people necessarily.
Well, the interesting thing is where you see community land ownership, for example in North Harris, where trees are being regenerated because they're native stock, and where deer are actually owned by the local community, and where you pay a small amount of money, about £10, to go out and shoot a hind, quite a bit more to shoot a stag, but you can fill your freezer with meat that's from your land, although it's communally owned by 500 people or something like that. And the main thing about that is it's so different from most of the kinds of land that we have, but if we have more community ownership, it's entirely possible that sort of approach can reintroduce people. Instead of being poachers trying to take away from somebody who's got an awful lot, that you become owners, and therefore you become, because you are part of the fauna of that area just as much as the deer is, and until we have that mentality in people's heads, there's no way that we're going to change the ground in Scotland.
Great. Okay, we've got another one. You didn't answer that, but perhaps you could put that behind your ear to fill in with this. Yes.
I think there's a quick one from Michael Shilson. You say that natural regeneration can be speeded up by introducing suitable seed. Does this mean planting native trees?
And is that a different one you've got, Chris?
No, it's just clarifying, it's Alan Savoury? Is that?
Alan Savoury.
The short answer is yes.
And you're ducking that one again, that's fine. Right.
Can
Right, yourself?
Can I say something about that? Initially, when the Ascent Crofters were going to reforest things, Fountain Forestry were bringing seed from the east of Scotland. They didn't succeed because the west coast stocks used salt in the air and so on, and much of the millions of trees that are growing in Ascent now are from local seed. And if you look at it now compared to even 20 years ago, there's beginning to be a much better balance of bog and rock to trees.
Okay, I see yourself there, and also, come on women, we've only had one, and so we need more before we finish. So if you've got a question, gals, start to get it out your lips. Yes?
Hi, you made reference to two times of depopulation in Norway, namely 1858-60 and the 1950s.
Yeah.
And you glanced over the density of population. I wonder if you have any information on the density of population in South West Norway, which is like Scotland, and you might be able to, and you might have the same information for here, and we might extrapolate of how much potential there is, rather than going from a political point of view, saying, listen, if we do the same way as Norway, this is how many people we could have on the land. Because one of the things that we hear about is, if you change in Scotland, you are going to put a lot of people out of business, where we can have to have an argument to say, well, yes, we might indeed lose some business, although I see that the hunting is still very much part of what you're envisaging, but we would introduce so many more people onto the land.
Right, well, I must have gone through this too fast. This graph here is population densities of South West Norway, the three main provinces of it. On the right, the column on the left is Highland region. And this is with the larger urban centres taken out.
Highland.
So the population density...
Is it possible to extrapolate that on a Scotland basis to say how many more people would be in the non-urban wasteland of Scotland?
If Highland region... Yeah, well, at the moment, Highland region outside Inverness has a population density of about 6 persons per square kilometre. In Sutherland, it's 2. In South West Norway as a whole, the figure is around about 15 to 20. So you're looking at a difference of more than double, 2 to 3 times. It depends regionally, depending on, obviously, the quality of the land. So if you look here, the density in Rogaland, which is the most favoured of these 3 regions, is considerably higher than in either Vest-Agder or in Hordaland. But the population on the land is a multiple of what it is in Scotland, Highland Scotland, taken as a whole.
So, is it possible to say, without changing land ownership, which is a moot point, but is it possible to turn around to landowners and say, listen, at the moment, chaps, you've got 4 people employing 4 people per whatever. Here's a possibility you employing 15 people per whatever. It must make your business and your estate much more sustainable and you more wealthy.
There's some head shaking going on behind you. Do you want to come in?
It's what I said before about the optimal size being related to purpose. And if your purpose is to have an estate, which is a simple business, killing deer, and you figure you're going to kill on your estate 1,500 deer, because that brings in 1,500 clients, each of whom is willing to pay £5,000 for the right to kill a deer. It's a calculation based on the purpose of your business. If I said to you, well, look, I'm going to bring 20,000 people and they're going to decide how many deer that they need for their refrigerator, you would not like that. So that's why I'm shaking my head. I don't have an answer, but there's some connection between residence, scale, and purpose. One possibility is that if you're a resident on the land, your purpose is constrained. How many deer do you need to feed your family? If you are not resident on the land, then you delegate the purpose, and generally that purpose is financial, and so your steward will decide 10,000 people over 5 years, killing 50,000 deer, will raise $500,000. That's a good purpose. So I don't have, as I say, I really don't have an answer, but there's a connection, an intimate connection, and it's easy to say expropriate the big landed estates. And it's not something I would oppose necessarily, but I'm not sure it's the answer.
Well, does this not bring us slightly into that same area of debate as you get with GDP? Because technically GDP goes up when hospitals are full, but that's not necessarily a great social outcome. So if anyone wants to pick it up, this is cool. I did see a Gallus gal come forward last and put the thing with Bob on, please.
Yeah, I just wanted, hi Duncan, I just wanted to ask whether it would be useful to unpack. I'm quite interested in all of these small farms and farmers who are deriving income from living locally and managing the land that they own. Whether they have subsidies or any kind of support to do this, or whether they are surviving there through a kind of crofting way of life, so they have multiple income streams, or what, whether you can say something about that, please.
Yes, Norwegian farming, like farming in Britain, is heavily subsidised. It's an extremely complex subject. the way that because Norway is not a member of the European Union, it means that the way in which farming subsidies are structured varies very differently from this part of the world. And then you end up in extremely complex and ultimately irresolvable debates as to who gets more and what effects these things have. But it is certainly true that Norwegian farming is, like farming here, subsidised to a very large extent.
This is about farm land ownership. If you compare Scotland to Norway, as far as I can understand, from the number of people who own Scotland's land is really quite not a very big number, but in Norway it must be much larger. And I just wondered, could somebody who, let's say, was not Norwegian, could they come in to Norway and buy up lots of land, or are the rules stricter there, or laws stricter than they are here?
Now, this again is a matter of some complexity, but the overall answer is that you are not allowed, for example, if you're the Sultan of Dubai, for example, the reason that you buy land in Scotland is you're allowed to do it. You're not allowed to do it in Norway. The rules are somewhat complex, but they strongly encourage owner occupation. This is, among other reasons, why many of the largest landowners in Scotland are Scandinavians.
So Anders Poulsen couldn't do what he's doing in Norway?
No.
He's a Dane.
I should say I wouldn't necessarily criticise Mr. Poulsen, who, as a landowner, I think is doing quite a good fist, but he comes from a Scandinavian culture, so what he's looking out for from his estates is rather different, same with the Rousings.
Angus, was that what you were going to ask? Right. I see two questions here, and then we're sort of coming to the end of our time a wee bit. So if anybody viewing has got any more questions they want to put through on Twitter and Facebook, put them through now. And if anybody's sitting on their hands in here, don't. Right, there's yourself, and there's the lass here. Oh, and there's you. Great, 3. Right, come forward and why don't you just ask your very simple questions one after the other.
You spoke a lot about how Norwegians love their forests, they own them, they go out into them from the ages of baby up to adults. And we know it's kind of similar here in Scotland, but we didn't talk about tourism and how important tourism in relation to ecosystem services is in Norway. I just wonder how that compares to here in Scotland.
Right, well, thank you for almost feeding me this question. Tourism. If I could urge you all, go and visit South West Norway. It's amazing how few people have ever been there. And no matter how much I tell you, it's not the same as seeing. I'll get to your specific question in a minute. If you look at the graph here, the Norwegian kroner has depreciated against the pound 44% over the last 2 years. It used to be 9 to the pound. It's now 13 and a bit to the pound. This means that you can go to Norway, and for example, if you go and stay in those cabins top right, it will cost you 10 quid a night. Recently, I had a group of people come to stay. They were there for a week. We travelled around. The total cost, flights, food, the lot, was £560 per person for a 5-night study tour. So one of the things you hear is that, we can't go because we'll have to sell our kidneys. It's not true. Norway is now quite affordable, and we had our best tourist season in years because of this. It's all because the oil price is down. It's bad for people in the oil business. It's good for people in the tourist business and who want to export wood, for example. So in Norway, tourism, mostly local, is a very big point. If you remember my previous slide, I won't go back to it, on farm incomes. A very large part of the income from woodland, other than timber, is in renting out or selling cabin plots, because Norwegians love to get out into the woods at the weekend. I can do the weekend weather forecast when I go to work on Friday. If it's crowded on the way in, it's going to be rainy. If it's not crowded on the way in, it means that the weekend coming up is going to be very nice, and a lot of people have bunked off early. So a large chunk of rural income is associated with tourism, mostly domestic tourism. The scope for foreign tourism has increased very greatly, and if all of you were to take my hint, I would be very happy. I'd like to stop being the middleman here. There's no reason why people in Scotland, especially people who are interested in land use issues or work in it, should be at least as familiar with their counterparts in South West Norway as they are with those that live in, say, Wales or England. There's no particular reason. Everyone speaks good English. You'll be very welcome. Do please go, see for yourself, draw your own conclusions.
Okay, we've got another 2 questions here. Yourself and then...
My name is David Long. Could I just say something as a small private woodland owner? I live in the Scottish Borders, and I was very lucky to able to buy 80 acres of former Forestry Commission land. And I'm the envy of many, many people around me. There are many people in the Borders who would love to be private, small woodland owners. But it's all tied up by big estates, and the land prices are so high. So I think Duncan's model would work superbly in Scotland if people like me and organisations like Borders Forest Trust, who are doing much of this kind of thing, could acquire more land. So I think the model is wonderful for Scotland. Thank you.
Right. You haven't all been paid but to sort of put these questions up. Right, that's fine. Okay, and finally?
I would suggest, maybe simplistically, that actually there's a huge educational opportunity here. And actually, let's give the people of Scotland an opportunity to learn something about the land, to actually go out and work on the land and actually own a piece of Scotland and actually get rid of all these absentee landowners. And you know, there is for the Scottish Government, there is a huge educational opportunity, create jobs, build small communities. Actually, let's get out there and do that.
Right. You might not find many folk arguing with you in the room. Yes, yourself. And finally then, have we any more Twitter and Facebook, and then that will be us finished? Yes.
Nothing on the live stream.
I just, coming back on that, I was just wondering if we had enough people that would know how to run a small holding on the land somewhere. I was in NORDIC for my holidays at Inveree, and I was fascinated to see the the sawmill that was there, and they were using a whole lot of forestry that seemed to be part of the NORDIC Foundation. I don't know how sustainable the whole thing is. I don't really know much about economics, but I did notice they seemed to be importing a number of young people to try and do some of the work that was required. So I was wondering whether we'd have enough people that would actually have the knowledge or the competence anymore to live as the Norwegians do.
Right. Who wants to answer that? You're not picking that one up, Duncan? I mean, you can pass if you want.
Well,
I think the problem about continuity in Scotland is a big difficulty. People have lost these skills. It occurs to me that so many people want to live in cities, towns. The will to live in the countryside is going to have to be very much regenerated in people's outlooks, because I don't think that they see the countryside as a welcoming thing. I think they see the countryside as alien to many of the people of Scotland who've been forced to, through industrialisation and post-industrialisation, caught in a very narrow band across the middle of our country. And I would very much like to hope that it was possible. But the whole structures of our land owning, whether it's crofts, which are terminally underused, and big estates, are definitely not the kinds of means whereby people could put down roots again. And so part of the community approach to that is, one, government's trying to double the amount of community land from 500,000 acres to 1 million by 2020, but also the need to have that kind of ability to buy land and live on it. And you know, I've seen in Falkland estate a farmer decided to, an owner turning what was a barley field into small units for new farms, 2.5 hectares on 5-year leases. But that's such a rare thing, and so therefore we've got to actually tackle some of the more basic things. And at that level, it's the last thing I'll say tonight, just probably at the moment. We've got a land use strategy that's been relaunched. We've got a planning review that's looking at some of the ways to make it more possible for people to live in the countryside. We don't have the right to buy, in the case of agricultural units, We are learning a little bit about how to manage deer a little better, but we don't yet have the impetus to be able to have the power to encourage people to live in the places that we really value, and I believe that they would once they see some more examples come through, and I think the North Harris one and several others are going to be pilot schemes that people can look up to, and I hope that we can provide a lot more of them. But on the mainland there's far less interest in doing these things than on the islands, and we've got a big staircase to climb in order to get people to think that they would love to live in the countryside again.
There's one question I often ask at events, which I'll just ask now, which is how many people in the room can fish? This is an exceptionally good night. That's about 8, 9, 10. How many people in the room own a boat, even a small rowing boat? Right, this is also a bit of a world record. Right, that would just be a very different profile, actually, of almost any of the Nordic countries. There would be much more boat ownership, and people would have skills relating to the land because they would use it. So it's true that people begin to drop off skills when they don't have access to something. But I've also seen in my lifetime, particularly as a trustee on Egg, a whole influx of kids who had no connection actually with the island and who have really adapted really quickly, because when you're to get right down to it, you do have some nature to contend with. So, you know, let's be hopeful.
Didn't ask how many shot.
Say that again?
Didn't ask how many hunted.
Well, let's do that. How many people hunt? Right. That's fine. And slightly generally dispersed as well. Now, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there unless there's anything else that I've missed from our streaming people. Have I? No? Right. Okay, well, takes me a feet, I think. Well, thank you so much. That's been, I mean, just beyond fascinating, Duncan. Isn't it been just a tremendous meeting? Say that Duncan, like all our speakers, goes to see tomorrow some of the civil servants in the Scottish Government, which will be useful. And he's also got a meeting with people from the Forestry Commission Scotland, so he'll be saying this, and he has been saying this actually quite a number of times, but this thinking will find its way into quite a number of other places that are important to reach. The pictures, the presentation is already up on the Nordic Horizons website, so I hope that anybody streaming also found it there. I should have said that at the start. But if you want to catch any of those particular statistics that you maybe couldn't see from the back of the room, then do check it out. It's on nordichorizons.org. Just while we're on the question of the theme of pictures, what about our pretty banner? It's only taken us, I think we've been going for about between 4 to 5 years, and we've finally got a banner. So, you know, that probably means we'll stop working next year. And a couple of announcements. We're thinking of having a wee swally on the 18th of December. That's Friday the 18th, between 7 and 9 o'clock. It's to sing Nordic carols. We have some actual people who could sing them, join in. It's to have some food, and to talk a little bit about what you might want us to do as Nordic Horizons in the year ahead. So we need to, we have a wee problem which I hope we haven't had tonight, where sometimes if things are free, people say they'll come and then don't come. If that happens with something where we're providing catering, we're going to be really stuck. So we don't totally want to charge people, but can I just say, I mean, do people think it would be reasonable to charge like £4 for that? You know, because it would give us a little bit of income, cover some of our costs, and then if you were coming, you'd possibly, I don't know, you know, maybe people are a bit more cavalier in this neck of the woods, but they wouldn't want to lose their £4 and it might give us a sort of expected attendance. So we'll put this up online after this meeting on Eventbrite, but that's Friday the 18th at 7 for a couple of hours. So come along, eat, sing and be merry. And our 2 other meetings for next year are the 23rd of February, where we'll be talking about cooperatives. Quite relevant actually, because I think we're going to be it's a Finnish talk on that occasion. They have some of the largest forester farmer cooperatives probably in the world actually. So we'll be getting us a talk by the union who manage all the cooperatives, and that allows us to get a lot of information from those massive great cooperatives down to the smaller ones. And on the 8th of March, we have one of the architects who's responsible for moving the town of Kiruna in the north of Sweden 4 kilometres east. I've got to slightly declare an interest here because I did a Radio 4 programme which will be on very soon. In fact, I think on Friday, no, Sunday at 6 o'clock on Radio 3, which is looking at the whole business of the mining operation which has undermined the town, which in turn has then decided to put the money up for moving the entire town 4 kilometres east. How can you do that? How do people respond? How do the Sami people particularly respond? And how have they, as they claim, produced the most democratic move in history? So that's the two coming up. We'll have that on the website so you can, book early. Unfortunately, we don't get into the Parliament very often, so we'll probably hold one of those meetings in Kiruna. That one will be in the Scottish Storytelling Centre, and the one on co-ops is actually being organised by the cross-party group here. So we're just kind of bagging along at the end of that, and it will be in the Parliament. Right, a whole lot of information. Sorry to sort of put it that way, but if you look at Twitter, follow Twitter, join our Facebook group, or look at the website, you'll get all those details. Surely I haven't forgotten anything, but inevitably I will, except to say that we're going to the pub, Hema. Yes. That's always Dan's thing. as soon as I say Dan, I just think pub. Right. It's not a bad thing to have associated with you, Dan. So it's Hema, the Swedish bar, which is around the corner, which is where we're all going, if you want to come round there. But I think finally, thank everybody who put tonight together. Alison Balhari, who's not here, but was mentioned by Duncan, who does all our organising for us. April, who may still be in the room, who's doing a lot of the coordination with the Parliament. Rob, who was a sponsor for the meeting, thank you very much. And our fantastic Dundonian, because he really still is, Duncan Halley.